RMR.
Well, the whole start of Margaret River, 1924, and group settlement. So that was the first bit of public infrastructure. Basically, the history, both of the old hospital before it became the community centre and since then, is a summary of the town.
The sense of the variety of people who come and go through that place was there right from the start.
I'm Bill Bunbury, and this is the story of how the people of Margaret River fought to save their old wooden hospital and how in the last 30 years turned it into a vibrant community centre.
Yes, I was involved right from the word go, actually. I can't quite remember how we all started, but we came together, whether it was BPW or different groups came together. So we started the adult daycare. The silver chain person at the time came and talked to us, and we organised the bus, and we had lunch, and people came in from the farms and different places. So we started what's now the bigger daycare. We had community events, we had workshops, just lots of things going on. And Station Road was available, so that was a good start.
On the corner of Station Road and Warcliffe Road, where the doctor's surgery is now, there was a little old house there, and it started there.
Long-time community centre supporter Ros Blakeney, and before her Anne Shepherdson. Jennifer Girardi was another early Station Road participant.
I was one of the founding members of the Station Road Community Centre. There were a few community centres sprinkled around WA, and some people brought the idea to us and said, look, this is really great for community building and resilience, and there was a real need for it, to create a greater connection. The wine industry had got on its feet, the town was growing, and it was obvious that we needed to make the town feel as if they had services. We were still a small town, but we had lots of people with energy and motivation who came along, and we had a really motivated group who were running it.
Joyce Bennett and Anne Shepherdson and Lloyd Shepherdson was involved, Joan and David Barber. I started off up at the Station Road Community Centre. I did a couple of courses there, and I gave a couple of courses, sewing and patchwork. And one of the courses I took involved Tess Manette teaching basic car maintenance for women.
The council had given the community centre use of the house prior to my involvement, but around the time I got involved, the town of Margaret River was growing quite rapidly, and the need for a larger centre was very evident because the 3 or 4 rooms available at the house were overutilised.
It was always an idea. I don't even know who started the idea that to use the hospital, but we outgrew our size, really.
Previously, former Perth journalist Kim Murray had started a new newspaper in Margaret River.
It was very obvious then that the need for a new hospital was paramount in the town. So I relayed that through to Brian Burke, who I knew, and he was an ex-journalist as well. Brian said that he would come and visit Margaret River, and only about 2 weeks, I think, before the first edition of the Mail came out. So that was a story that I sat on, and it was the headline, the first headline in the paper, Burke to visit on Old Hospital. And it was really difficult keeping that a secret. But he did eventually visit and came away, and I think about a few months after that, they announced that Margaret River would get its new hospital. Of course, when the hospital began and the old hospital was just sitting there, it did open this debate. Somehow it emerged that Dennis Horgan wanted to use it as a university, a viticulture university. And it caused outrage in the community because people had already seen the possibilities of using it as a community centre.
I thought what they were proposing was a great thing, having a centre for wine excellence and some kind of a university complex. It was a great idea. Now we've got one, I still think it's a great thing. It was just that I felt it was the wrong place for it. I felt like this building had been built to serve the community, and the community in general rather than a specific part of the community, and that for me has been an enduring thing.
For long-time Margaret River resident John Elfrink, the old hospital was an important part of the town's history.
I think they were just going to bulldoze the whole lot and put some fancy brick building up, and Margaret River hadn't got much in the way of old buildings, and the hospital was in good condition. They looked after it very well, and Joyce Bennett, she was the main pusher for that.
The people I remember most are Joyce Bennett, who everybody talks about Joyce. She was amazing. She would get a vision of something in her head, and she had the energy and the enthusiasm, and she could pull together a group of people around her that were buoyed by her vision and would just help out. And she just was a person who got out of bed and did stuff, made it happen.
Architect Theo Matthews was also inspired to join the push to save the old hospital for the community.
There were people who felt that it was part of their community. And we young Turks, because we were in our 30s, I suppose, we felt that there was going to be a takeover by Notre Dame University of what was really our property, public property.
But I do remember going along to the infamous meeting at the Old Cultural Centre.
It was high theatre. It was high drama. You've got all these combatants coming together, eyeballing each other, and the stakes were high. We said that Father Glover was bussing in dead Catholics. It was getting to that stage. It was really a very tense atmosphere there.
The one enduring vision I have is of looking down and seeing lots of grey-haired people that nobody in town knew that had been bussed in as meeting stackers. People were very passionate about keeping it for the community. People were passionate about using it for another purpose. So it was a very interesting meeting, but I personally felt it was stacked in the favour of the Notre Dame. I mean, at the time we all knew each other in town. It was a whole different ball game. And when you see a whole load of people streaming in off a bus that you don't know, you go, yeah, what's going on here?
It was a spectacular evening, and the community put their case one by one, and eventually Peter Tannock, the head of Catholic education, he very intelligently and slowly just got up and he said, I can see that this community doesn't want this to happen in this venue.
But the old hospital still stood empty. The state government hadn't agreed to its transfer to the community. Tess Minette again.
Ostensibly it was empty, but I realised walking past there one day that in fact there was a doctor's surgery on the site and it had been there for yonks. I learnt that the party responsible for the site as a whole was the South West Development Authority. So I got in touch with the lady there and I asked her about the doctor's surgery, and apparently they had a lease that was continuing for some time after the rest of the hospital was vacated. And so I realised, obviously, then that it was possible to lease other areas of the ground, not just the grounds, but the buildings. And she said, yes, of course it is. At around about the same time, there happened to be a conference in Perth, and it just so happened that the Premier was there, Peter Dowding, and I schnaddled him after the Saturday night dinner and told him all about the community centre, the potential enlarged community centre at the old hospital, that in fact it was in good condition, it wasn't riddled with white ant. And after about half an hour, he said, look, you'd make a great politician. I wish you were on my side. It's yours. And that's how the lease was signed. Went back to Margaret River, told the organisation that we had it, that it was promised to us by the Premier, and that's how it was done. I was tickled pink that we got away with it, but I knew there were a lot of forces, not against us, but forces that were bigger than us. And so it was a demonstration to me that with the right principles and with the principle of the purpose of the people behind it, that it would prove itself, and 30 years on it has.
We joined the two committees together, and I stayed on the committee for a while, and we were able to bring all the furnishings and programs from the community centre over to the Community Resource Centre and started running the programs there. And of course, there was such a great amenity and there was so much space, we were immediately able to start letting it out to other groups, community groups. That was fabulous. It was actually more of a viable situation in the long term.
We set about having a festival opening, which was great. I think that was September or October, they had an opening, and it was really good.
I don't think there were many issues, really. I mean, the need for it was evident, so it wasn't a matter of having to crowd people into small spaces. It was a matter of showing people what they needed, and essentially people who wanted to utilise it could let their imaginations go because there was so much space. One of the things was the potential for vandalism because it was such a large site. So we were concerned about lack of security to a certain extent. There was a nurses' quarters on the east of the site, and that was perfect for some caretakers.
Jerry Riley and Margot Edwards became the first caretakers.
Yeah, the opportunity came up to be caretakers in the old nurses' quarters. This was in 1990. I had my first baby while we were there in February in 91, which was very convenient. Got to walk across the trees to the hospital.
Later on, other caretakers also had a baby while living in the nurses' quarters, as then Centre Administrator Donna Dornan remembers.
Our caretaker at the time, who was living on site, he and his wife were expecting a baby. And we thought this was wonderful because, of course, the old hospital hadn't had a real baby born on the site for many, many years. But they decided they wanted to have a water birth. So we had to get somebody in to actually test the supports underneath the bathroom where they were going to have this huge pool to make sure that mother and baby wouldn't disappear through the floor. But anyway, all went well and it was a lovely baby and we were very happy to welcome it and a birth at the old hospital.
Much later, Margot found out that this was women's space.
We were working very closely with the Wardandi, with Vilma Webb and Francis Gillespie. We had some of the Wardandi men staying in the nurses' quarters and they just were really uncomfortable there. They weren't happy there. So we moved them out and into another place and we put the elder women in, and they settled in to that matron's quarters end of the building and they just completely relaxed. They were really happy there and they told me very clearly it was women's space and that the men would never have been, one of them had actually got sick while he was there and they never would have been able to stay there because it was women's space.
Living in the old hospital also suited Margot.
It was simple. It was in good nick, beautiful wooden floors but lots of little rooms, which assuming they were nurses' quarters rooms. It really was like being caretakers. We did feel like we were custodians of care over the whole of the buildings of the community centre, and so it almost felt like we were camped on site for 18 months or so.
Were these buildings haunted?
The nurses' quarters wasn't, but I swear the main buildings were. It got to the point where I actually wouldn't lock up at night. I was pregnant and it just gave me the heebie-jeebies being in the main hospital building. I'm sure there was ghosts. Wandering souls. I suppose the operating theatre saw so many lives come through and some lives lost, and I think they leave an imprint on a building. Now I could walk in there now and there's absolutely no imprint there at all. This was very early on and it had been vacated and we were there right from that beginning and there weren't actually many tenants.
It didn't grow like Topsy, but it satisfied the needs that were evident at the house in Station Road. But in the smaller facility, you could be using 3 or 4 rooms a day, every day, for 5 or 6 days a week. At the new facility, of course, everybody could be catered to.
Barbara Maidment ran the Margaret River Business Enterprise Centre and was one of the first tenants.
So it was a little bit lonely initially. And to even get a cup of tea, you know, we had to wander down this dark, dismal hallway to what used to be the hospital kitchen. And it was a little bit awkward at first. A lot of the rooms were still as they had been left when the hospital moved to its new premises. So there was frayed carpeting, and one of my rooms actually still had an old hospital bed in it, and one of those old metal bedside tables, which I purloined for storage, but it was really a bit humorous to walk in to where my secretary was supposed to sit to discover a hospital bed.
But the money for renovations and changes to the building still had to be found.
The Shire made it very clear that they didn't want to give us any money ever. I think it went back to when the very first point where people wanted it for a different use. And so when it was vested in the Shire, they just didn't want to know about spending any money on it. They just saw it as a ruin that would be a pit for money to be shovelled into.
There were necessary fund writing applications. I think that was one of the busiest roles. It was a large building and it needed to not look so much like a hospital and be more usable for the community. So there was a lot of applications to try and get funding to make it work.
There was 2 grants. For the first grant, they got about 90,000 from the lotteries, and then they got another grant for about 200,000, I think, and that was also from the lotteries because they had all these rooms available. They wanted to get them all done up, and then the biggest group who wanted to get in there was the TAFE. They set up there. We had enough money coming in from them to employ a full-time person on site, and that was Donna Dornan.
John Alfrink was the first community centre treasurer. When he left the committee, Noel Conway took over as treasurer.
Without Donna, I can't imagine that the centre would have developed the way that it did. I just don't see that it would have had the same history without Donna being there during those early years. About 15 years, I think she was manager there.
It was always trying to get things done on a shoestring, but sometimes things fell into our lap. The local poly was very keen that a project be in Margaret River, so we got $20,000 to do the garden, and it was a really nice synergy because Jodie Lane, who was teaching permaculture at the time at TAFE, wanted a project.
Yeah, that was a fantastic project. There was a group of us that thought it would really make a much better garden than a car park. The 3 main people that were involved in getting the community garden actually happening was myself working for TAFE, Donna Dornan, who was working for the community centre, and Sally Hayes, who was working for the council. And the 3 of us formed a team. I organised to run a landscape design course with the students that were studying horticulture, and we asked the students to interpret that. So we looked at the existing functions of the old hospital and the new library and the new hospital, and I put it to the students, create a design that would work to bring those together. And I had a fabulous bunch of students. We then put those designs in the library and displayed them and invited the public comment and to choose the best design. There was one design that stood out by a young guy called Damon. People wanted that design, and that's the design that we went ahead with.
I was doing community services orders at the time, so one of my guys on community service did the steps, and I think Al West did the lovely wooden seats, and then somebody from the Collective Guild did the hand-printed mosaic in the middle of the garden.
TAFE were our biggest tenant, and they gave us an income to keep Donna going, and then other small groups joined. I think there was an Alcoholics Anonymous and the Conservation Movement. They all set up in there because there was lots of little rooms, you know, all the different wards that could become available, but it turned into a very vibrant community setup.
The community centre has always had the community at the forefront of their minds. They've never done anything, to my knowledge, for a profit that doesn't benefit the community. In fact, it's in our constitution. The Community Resource Centre has always been fiercely independent of Shire and other things. We really have looked after ourselves. We've renovated all the buildings, and through various grants, heritage grants and Commonwealth grants, and Lotteries Commission has been very generous. But also our tenants have had to pay rents, but very reasonable rents, especially if we wanted the service in Margaret River, we would bend over backwards.
Conductor of the River Song Choir, Ruth Boyd, is one long-term tenant who appreciates both the low rental costs and the space available.
To be honest, I chose it because it was central and I could afford it, because I didn't want to charge too much for singing, and it's the most accessible building as far as the cost, that it's so available and so reasonably charged. But the building that we were in has the most beautiful acoustics, and it turned out to be a lovely place to sing. By young bunny banks and by young bunny ways, where the sun shines bright on a blue moon, where me and my true love will never meet again, on the bunny, bunny banks of La Blonde.
Initially, in the early 1990s, extensive work was needed to make the buildings functional for their new role. Local architect Linton Hodson became involved at an early stage.
Joyce Bennett, she introduced me to what the Community Resource Centre did and stuff, and softening me up, I think, to help with architectural work when they got the lease on the old hospital.
There was a lot of work that needed to be done. And the veranda just outside my office, actually, which was Jarrah, had already been deteriorating, and we had to do some repairs in order to make it safe for people to come into my office.
The biggest problem was the fact that the buildings were very low set, so any rain would drain under the buildings, which meant it damaged the stumps. So the first thing was to stabilise the structure. There's no point in building new stuff on dodgy floors, so it's trying to level the floors up, re-stumping. Only the outside stumps needed to be done, but we had to dig out from there, number one, to get to them, and number two, to keep the water from flowing under there. Things like taking the plasterboard off the wall frames and finding how the walls were built in 1924.
Heritage architect Chris Keane also advised on the building renovations.
They needed a heritage architect who had enough experience in Western Australia, who was practical and able to work with an old timber building and to work with the community and try and make the building last. Basically, structurally, it was pretty good. Needed maintenance, and you could see what the ongoing maintenance was going to be, and you could see what the major issues were going to be in long term. And before I'd done this, I'd done various other buildings which say, how can I use this building because it was used for that before.
The Margaret Cecil building had been built at the Margaret River Hospital in 1929 as a rest home for expectant mothers.
Well, the Margaret Cecil building was funded by the Margarets of Great Britain. The roads weren't roads back then, they were tracks, and in winter they were mud. They were quite remote. A cart ride that could take half a day to get into town when you're about to give birth, it's most uncomfortable.
Long-time community centre employee Lynn Morford is familiar with this story.
Yes, Margaret Cecil came here and was appalled to see that women were coming in to the hospital. When it was really near their due time, they'd come and they'd have to sleep out on the veranda till they went into labour. And once they went into labour and had their babies, they were allowed in the hospital. And so she went back and collect, was it a shilling, from the Margarets of England. And so that's how the money to do the original rest home.
Providing a place for pregnant ladies to come in, and a few days before they were due, it would have been luxury to actually have that accommodation compared to what the group settlers had to put up with in the early times.
Margot Edwards' passion for theatre found the Margaret Cecil building in particular to be very adaptable.
We were in the Margaret Cecil building for quite some time. That was actually the home of, as the community centre grew, the youth theatre moved around to different things, and we were only really using it on Saturdays and sometimes on weekends. School holidays, mind you, I would run longer workshops and we would use the grounds, we'd use the Trellis Theatre, but the Margaret Cecil building was wonderful because it had a big central area. So we did media club shows in there, and the Margaret Cecil building was so fantastic because it had little offices. Beck Juniper had a little studio there. I think Jude Lonigan had a hat making studio there. The circus was there, the youth theatre was there, our little media club, which was making videos with teenagers, all working out of all the little rooms around that central area, and having that central indoor space is probably the biggest space.
Space has always been an important part of the community centre concept, and that involved moving some buildings, as architect Linton Hodson recalls.
Yes, it's our ecological footprint. We talk to it now, but it's just our physical footprint. And it's also the spaces between. A room is what's outside the window, and it's creating the efficiencies in space so that by moving the doctor's surgery out to behind the nurses' quarters, that opened that up, because before it was just like a car park. It's in the back of the buildings, it's really constrained sort of thing, but open that up, it's open to the street, and that space, I think, is the gem. With what they've done with the Isaac's house and the church, have just elaborated on that, and the fact that that courtyard made a place for those buildings to retreat to when they weren't needed elsewhere. So it's almost like a retirement home for old buildings, shall we say.
We moved Isaac's house from the bottom of Tunbridge Street, and the Historical Society were allowed to use that as our headquarters, and we leased that for a number of years until we moved over to the old settlement.
Community Centre Committee Chair Sally Hayes watched the Isaac's cottage arrive at the community centre.
It cost us $11,000 to bring it 100 metres down the road. We had 3 police cars, we were lifting power poles, we had to take out a portion of the front fence and a couple of bushes to get the truck into the central courtyard. And then we had an amazing character called Percy Putt, who was the house removalist. And we reviewed the site and said where we wanted it. We wanted it to sit in parallel with the soup kitchen building, the old doctor's surgery. And so we could eventually link the verandas when he got a bit more money. And Percy backed this massive truck with this house on it through the courtyard, and he reversed it in, and there was a point at which the front corner of the truck was about 3 millimetres away from the chimney and the Margaret Cecil building as he came around the corner, and he inched it around, which was great. And he hopped down out of the truck, and he was not a tall man. He jumped out of his truck, cigarette still hanging out of his mouth, and he said, "I've measured it up, Sally." He said, "You said you wanted it 5 metres apart," and he said, "It's 5.5. Do you want me to move it?" That epitomises the place as well. And we went, no, it's fine, Percy, just leave it where it is. It's straight, it's level, let's go.
Percy Putt also moved the old Uniting Church to the community centre. Barbara Maitland watched its progress.
I was in my office when I knew that building was going to be moved. So I had my camera with me, and I went out and stood in the middle of Tunbridge Street, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do these days, 10 years ago or so, and took photographs of that old church being pulled up Tunbridge Street by Percy Putt and his moving crew, and how the Western Power guys were out there with big poles to hold up the cross-street wiring so that this building could get underneath. I mean, it was classic. Absolutely. You think if one thing went wrong, this whole thing would collapse.
Since they moved the Uniting Church there from up the top of Churchill Street, and that was another building that could have been lost to the community, but that's also saved, and it's a nice asset to the town. And as the town gets bigger and gets newer buildings, that site will be an asset, and then also it gives a lot of heritage to our area.
Heritage architect Chris Keane had a vision for creating space within the complex for community activities.
The space between the nurses' quarter and the hospital, I've always felt that if you want a community centre, basically if you can get a couple of trees under which you can sit and then use that space, it's multi-purpose, because we're not going to be able to put a marquee up or have something permanently that gives a lot of people chance to be in a space. So the central grass area to me is very important. And at the far end, we've just put a bit of a stage whereby somebody can stand up and give a speech or something. But it means you've got a good space in the centre of town.
The courtyard area has been used extensively for community events, but the farmers' market was one activity that outgrew the available space.
I was in my office one day, and Don Hasty, Ian Parmenter, Naomi O'Hara walked in and said, "We'd like to hire the centre for a market." And I said to my committee, "They want to hire it for a market then?" "Yes, let's do it." And we embraced it. We really embraced it, and it was a fantastic event for quite a while, till Don and Ian got busy in other areas and it went slumped a bit, but the centre still supported it. And then it became big again, and then of course it became one of those things that were becoming, even though the market was only 4 hours a week, it was dominating the whole centre. And I think we go back to that thing about the centre being a seeder. Let's grow this idea until it's profitable, and then let's find another spot for it and wish it well and wish it good luck.
It outgrew it. It became too popular. It became too good. And where they are now is much better. There were too many things going on the site. The demands were starting to become too great of, we need to do this and we must have that. But there were other tenants in the building who need to be satisfied for their needs, not just one thing. It's a community centre.
And in a way, I mean, the community centre saw itself as a stepping stone. And so the child out of school care grew, and actually the Shire took that on and that moved away. The adult daycare moved away. We were always happy to be a stepping stone. It wasn't always that we had to cling on to everything.
A lot of the community groups that we've had there over the years are still there. We did have the Historical Society for a long time. We gave them the building rent-free because we knew that that was important for them to actually be part of the community and to collect the history. And we had Red Cross, which only just left a couple of years ago because we just didn't have enough space. They needed a bigger area, and they were in the little nurses' quarters. That's now been restored and got other tenants in there. So we did have some tenants for a long, long time, but their needs changed and they moved to other spaces. We had TAFE as our main tenant, and they paid with their rent for the ongoing upkeep and the wages, which was great. And then they built the new TAFE, which was fantastic. They could move to a bigger space, which was what they needed. A little old building wasn't enough for them, and we were thrilled for that because we felt like we were part of the success of TAFE going on to doing what they've done.
And in fact, when TAFE was leaving to go to the education campus, we were at a real hiatus in terms of what are we going to do when we lose that fund, because that was the strongest rent base that we had. And that was when we made the decision to take the 8-place occasional childcare and turn it into a 26-place long day care.
And I remember we were out the back and wandering around, and Donna said, "Look, one of the ideas I've had is that there is a need for childcare in Margaret River." We all stopped and looked at each other and we just went, "That's it." And then we started dancing under the pine trees, which is just really crazy because we never do that kind of thing. We're going to be able to care for people and care for families, fathers, mothers, children. That was what Margaret Cecil Building was built for, was as a place for mothers to give birth and for families to start. So we felt it was absolutely the right fit for that particular building.
Linda Green was appointed as director of the childcare centre. She had a huge task and only a few months to convert old buildings into a long daycare centre.
They actually hired me in the childcare centre in July, and we didn't open till I think it was October or November. So I had several months where I actually worked with the tradespeople. We opened up the laundry to the outside and put a little toilet there so children could access the toilet when outside. A lot of the glass had to be replaced with child-safe glass. Fencing had to be a certain height. So with the pool fencing around, all those sorts of things. And then once you've got all that, then the regulatory body come down and make sure that it's fine before you're allowed to open. So there was a lot of requirements.
And we did it, which was, I think, in some ways a lovely sort of circular way of coming back. You know, women coming in by dray to have their babies in this centre, and now looking after modern Margaret River children.
The childcare centre has now expanded to 56 places.
It's called the Community Centre for Children. We felt that that was an important link with it's a part of the community centre. The families who utilise that service really value the community values that are behind it, and the fact that in comparison with the commercial centres who have a slightly different purpose, and that open and inclusive welcome policy applies to everybody who comes to the childcare centre as well. So we take babies where the others don't, because that's something that people need.
Now I believe it works brilliantly for the community, because we have a great connection to things like the soup kitchen, and the children can grow vegetables and take them to the soup kitchen, and they see how what they have grown helps other people.
The soup kitchen, which David Seeger operates independently, but with us it's part of what we provide, and the childcare service. And so sometimes the mix of the soupy and the children can be quite interesting.
That actually started the same year as I started, but earlier on, so it started in July and I started in November. The soup kitchen at Margaret River is a quite different thing to what people imagine a soup kitchen is. It performs a lot of functions other than feeding people who are hard up for food. It is a wonderful place where people on limited incomes and with families can go and socialise and network in an alcohol-free environment. I see that rather than the food side of it, I've always seen that as its most useful function for the community.
It's another kind of nourishment.
Yes, it is another kind of nourishment. That's a great way to put it.
Dave Seeger has now been running the soup kitchen at the community centre for 25 years.
I had to fund it myself and did so for the first 8 to 10 years, which didn't reflect very well in my bank account, but it worked, you know. You can live a very humble life with, you have no choice when you haven't got much money, you live a humble life.
Dave had identified an unmet need in the Margaret River community.
It's surprising, and you don't really see it when you're walking up and down the main street. You don't see old ladies in big overcoats and shopping trolleys full of clothes in shop fronts like you do in cities. There are a lot of people in this town, and have been for a long time, who are living in the bush, living in their cars, living 10 to a house or 5 to a room, or homelessness below the poverty line. Those issues are very real here. You know, lots of single parents who are struggling. You know, wherever there are people, there are issues with drugs and alcohol and all the issues that accompany them. You know, it's all there.
The soup kitchen was a really good one, because it did a lot of community service. It really had a family atmosphere about it, and it was just so community-minded. And the people involved in that, like Dave Seeger in particular, were just brilliant and totally selfless. They didn't get paid for it.
I've worked with adults with disabilities, or many of whom have worked in the soup kitchen and making coffees there.
It's a crucial space. I love the low-key energy. It hasn't turned into a big new facility for people. It does feel like a real community space, and I know that a huge amount of good work has come out of there.
I think it's evolved into a place where people feel comfortable coming to that place, from people that come to the soup kitchen through to people that come there to work there as well, like the professional people that work from it. I feel it's an organic place. It changes and it moves with whatever is needed.
Liddell Huntley is now the centre manager, and earlier a tenant working for Centrelink.
There were other human service agencies, but families came for support or to link their young person, their teenager, in with youth worker or a support worker. There were other sorts of services there that supported people. The Centrelink agency was there. The emergency relief service was running and available to families who needed it.
And one of the big things that sticks in my mind is we decided at one point that if there was ever an emergency, we would make the centre available for it.
The community centre has, with the bushfires in 2011 and with the Miles family tragedy, it has been the place that the council and the police have come to the community centre and said, we need this to be a place where people can come to get support. It was a very important base after the Gracetown collapse.
Donna Dornan was our administrator at the time, and the minute that it all happened, she just swung into action. And I remember going in the morning after the accident first up, and we had Telstra there putting in extra lines. We had a whole swathe of government people came down, and we made the whole place available. So if anybody needed to come there, we had counsellors and we had extra phone lines. It is a designated emergency centre. If there's ever anything that we need it for, it's there for that.
There's been the bushfires. The centre was the place where people could come, where there were therapists to talk them through what had happened and things like that. And so lots of people were coming and going, the Red Cross, psychologists helping people, plus the practical assistance.
And after the bushfires emergency?
The bird houses, people who lost residences during the bushfires each made a bird house, which was a sign of new beginning, and then they decided that they wanted them to come to the centre. We thought that the idea was beautiful and they were a lovely positive reminder of the recovery from that process, so that's how they came to the centre and how they got put up in the foyer there.
Art and support for artists has always been an important component of the centre's role.
I certainly know I was there when the first artworks were bought, which were a couple of photos that are in the foyer, black and white photos that were from a high school exhibition, and that's become a regular thing now where committee members go to the high school art exhibition every year, usually by 2. Plus, for a while we had the Artist in Residence program. Any of the artists had to run community workshops, and when they left they were to donate a piece of their art to the centre.
Sometimes history and art came together.
There's a little brick building in the centre, which was the laundry, and that was built sometime in the 60s. It's the only brick structure on the property, and it was built as a laundry. Before that, the nurses used to have to boil up coppers to wash all the sheets. That little building, it's really important because it's a marker of when things changed radically for the women who worked in that building. And it meant that there were washing machines and there was not all that backbreaking labour that they'd had before. A few years after we were able to use the hospital, it then became an area where women were doing art. That was keeping that artistic side going.
But the community centre has kept the history of these buildings alive.
Chris Keane was the heritage architect, and Chris was very big on sense of place. He felt it was very important that we maintained that sense of place and kept it visible to people. That's how we started calling the spaces the nurses' quarters, the matron's quarters, the doctor's surgery, naming things in that way so that that kept it in people's mind, what it had been.
You go into a new building and it has no history. When you think of all the people who've had babies and accidents and come through the old hospital, when we had an open day here one day and we gave out certificates for everybody who was born at the old hospital, and we couldn't keep up. And the stories were amazing, and we had whole families there who had all been born in the old hospital. Or else, I remember I was here in 1952 with a broken leg and it was so cold there were icicles on the windows. The stories were amazing.
I think the gardens are an important part. They're old-fashioned, and that's part of what we want. And then the buildings, you've got the lovely verandas, and it's 100 years in a few years' time, and it's really pays homage to what was here before, the wooden buildings. And there's not a lot of wooden buildings still in the southwest, so it's great that historically has been able to be saved too. So I think that's a vital part of keeping the old hospital going.
Hospitals in particular are such a crux for community care and community support, and particularly the history of this one. Just the very nature of how the hospital evolved, how the town evolved, and how much they're cross-linked. And also really interesting linking with social support.
Social support includes helping families at Christmas.
Yeah, we have a Christmas hamper project. It started off just as a general need. Margaret River people are so generous. We put the call out, so we have a certain amount of money to buy certain goods. We make up a hamper. Then people donate things, and then they get to choose extra bits to go into their hamper. There are groups of people that come in and help pack the hampers. There's people that come in on the day and help with distribution. And I get to do the toy room, and I love it. I remember one little girl once, I said, you can have anything you want, and she picked up a packet of pencils. But she kept looking at the My Little Pony set, and I said to her, you can have that if you like it. And she went out, and it was such a great moment, this little girl with almost stroking the ponies through the packaging. That kind of thing, that little girl, even in our society, had not many things. And I think that's what people forget, that there are people that need help. And it's been Lynn Morfoot's baby for quite a few years now.
Some groups and organisations have been supporting it pretty much since it started. Others come and go. The year before last, Rapids Landing School did a collection amongst their school children. The numbers have stayed really quite steady for quite a long time.
Are there other success stories?
We supported women who had gone back to school to learn to do certain things. So we helped quite a few women to get back into the workforce in better jobs than they were doing. One of the things was WestTrack. It was for kids that were in trouble. They would come down in a bus. One of the things they built was the veranda on the front of the nurses' quarters. And not long ago I actually met someone again who'd been on that program, and they said it turned their life around. To hear that feedback, that it made a difference to one person.
Empathy is probably something that is a very strong thread through the place.
We can't appreciate it unless we lost it. Let's hope we don't, because it is a really special place and we take it a little bit for granted. It's a safe place for people and activities that don't fit anywhere else. Not coping with things, go there, because there's various counselling services there as well. So it's a safe zone, shall we say.
For many people, it's not specific services, but the feel of the buildings and the gardens that makes the community centre a special place.
Definitely. I thought there's something about the spirit of a building, and that's what came with the building. So that building had been sung in a lot, and it is sung in as a church, and it had been worshipped. So whatever had been going on in that building felt very good. And when it came to the new setting, we wanted to carry on that kind of energy. It's built into the walls. And the gardens too. I mean, how beautiful are the gardens every time you walk past there during the day? I mean, I think everyone's got cuttings of those geraniums. Take little cuttings. A lot of the gardens have come from that place. That's a lovely sense too.
I think that it's a very approachable place, and that's where the home type base of the original Station Road probably has been carried through there.
And new initiatives?
Yes, the radio station is going to be housed in the nurses' quarters. Quite public, noticeable spot. I think we will give them some good material, and I think they will also be able to promote the community centre as well.
Is there a place for historical tourism?
The history of the Margaret Cecil building in particular, which was the beginning of this whole thing. How many people in the community know about that history right now? Well, I think the percentage is low. So historical tourism is gaining a lot of respect these days. And there's no reason why that couldn't be part of it.
In a way, we've been a little bit of a sleeping community there. We've not pushed ourselves out there as such, because a lot of the stuff that happens there is still very personal to the people involved. But I think people sort of wonder, what's this strange little oasis in the town? It's perfectly situated because it's so close to town and to other facilities. It's just the perfect site for it, I think. And the other thing is, like, now we're talking 30 years. That's become history, what we did 30 years ago. So in 30 years' time, that history would have been lost altogether.
30 years ago, Margot Edwards and her partner Jerry Riley were caretakers at the old hospital. How does Margot see the community centre now?
Healing. People coming together and being healed or being healers or working with people. I mean, the role of the community centre today is so vital in terms of the bushfire relief, COVID relief, so many ways that the community centre services community and the tenants there service communities. Hospital is the core service in terms of life and death, and the community centre, I would say, is the next layer of our living life and how we cope, and people who need services, who need to come together, who want to, who choose to celebrate life. And it's not a money place. It's never been a money place. It's a place of trading, culture, service and care. It exists so strongly these days as a centre for the services that we can use when we're in a crisis. I think it's absolutely perfect that these buildings have had this ongoing journey.
But it is very much in need of some love and money. We have a 5-year building scope of works that will be quite extensive. And it'll be quite intrusive, I think, for a lot of our tenants. It'll also be amazing to see a beautiful old building revived and given an extension of life.
We've been really blessed over the years with a very, very strong partnership with Lottery West. They have consistently helped us with re-roofing, with rewiring, with gutters. But then you've got the other side of it that we're facing at the moment, and we've been having the childcare centre helped us to be financially stable.
The Community Centre for Children is also helping to link the next generation with Australia's long history.
We've always tried to reflect the Wadandi culture within the centre and the children, so we have made efforts to connect with them, and we have built an Indigenous garden, and we've had Wadandi people come and help with that garden and build that garden. And currently we're working with the Underlup Association. They are helping with us a grant that we received for building our educator knowledge about Wadandi culture and language.
Anne Shepherdson, who was there at the beginning, appreciates the centre's services.
Well, I mean, childcare. You have the children's toy library and play groups. The essence of the community centre is the spirit of the people. The managers and the staff are fantastic. It's run on a very small wage structure, really. It's amazing what they do for what happens there. So great credit to the staff of that building, I say.
It's been a wonderful place to work, like a real privilege to me. It's a heart place, a place of the heart.